Hey there, and welcome to this episode of the podcast. Now, this episode of the podcast is from a follower question on Instagram. And the question was, they would be interested to know more about what to expect when they're in a calorie deficit. When you're in that process of losing weight, losing body fat, what do you expect? How are your hormones going to change? How are you going to feel? How should you react to that? What should you do? So I thought this was an interesting question for me to dive into. Obviously, having been someone who's been in a calorie deficit multiple times, dieted down to very low levels of body fat percentages, and also coached people through that same process through my online coaching program, I felt like it was a good topic for me to dive into to maybe give you some insight into what to expect that's coming up in the future for you, or if you haven't started your diet yet, then what actually might you want to set yourself up for and how you want to think about approaching your calorie deficit. So I thought this was a great question. Now, the first thing I would say is that this is going to sound a little bit depressing, but dieting can be a very lonely experience. It's very rare that a group of friends or people within your family all go on a period of fat loss at the same time. Typically, you may be the only person in your family that's trying to lose weight. Or maybe within your group of friends, you're the only person that's really committed to losing that weight, losing that fat. Now, it's a case of you're doing that because this is super important to you, not to anybody else, but this is super important to you. But that doesn't make it any easier. It's a case of you feel like you're a little bit ostracized. You feel like a bit of a social pariah. So everyone wants to go for drinks. Everyone wants to go for meals out, dinner parties. Your family doesn't want to cut back on the foods that they're eating. They don't want to change. They don't want to adapt. So this creates this almost like lonely environment where you don't feel necessarily supported. You don't obviously feel like maybe you know what you're doing. Now that can be a case for a lot of different people, even when you're dieting down to very low levels of body fat percentage and you feel like, well, other people would say that you know what you're doing. But actually, if you're doing this for the first time, sometimes you don't even know if you're doing it right. And that can be a little bit disconcerting. So that would be the first thing, is that if you are experiencing those thoughts and those issues around this being like a very lonely experience and sometimes demotivating, that's absolutely normal. And what I would do if that was me in that situation, I'd go get myself some support and some accountability. Now, I've done exactly that almost with the Sculpt with Simon Facebook group that I've set up, which you can still join if you haven't already. Now, with the Sculpt with Simon Facebook group, what I'm doing is I'm doing a 12-week fat loss phase in front of everybody, in front of the world. And that's already helping me to be accountable to my goals. It's helping me to stick to my calorie deficit when otherwise I might have had a few extra calories here. I might have had a chocolate bar here. I might have, sneaked a little donut in there. But I feel like now I have to report into my group, my people that are following me, people that are hanging on to each word, and people are wanting to find out, okay, how do you actually do this? Now the fact that I feel like I'm accountable to them, that helps me stick to that process. And also because you're having interaction, you're having conversations, is you feel like you're not alone. So go and seek out, whether it's a Facebook group or whether it's a WhatsApp group with people online that you know, and all that different sort of stuff. Find a group of people that can help you, support you, and help you feel like you're not going through this experience alone. The other thing I would say is also make sure that your family are aware of how important your goal is to you, so that they're not kind of tempting you with fucking cake and tempting you with all these different treats and eating things in front of you. They are sensitive and they're aware. And if they do know that you're trying to lose weight and they are tempting you with donuts, then they're a fucking dick. But that aside. So you're at this stage where you're not really sure if what you're doing is right. You're not sure if you're making the right progress. You're not sure if you're making enough progress. And you're not sure if what you're feeling during this calorie deficit process is normal. So should you be feeling this hungry? Should you be feeling this lethargic? Should you be feeling like you can't be fucked to go to the gym? Should you be feeling like you want to stab the person next to you each time they fucking eat? Then who knows whether that's normal if you've never been through this process. So I'm going to walk you through some of the other things that are going to be happening on your calorie deficit, on your fat loss phase, so that you can kind of prepare yourself for it. Again, like if this is your first time going into a calorie deficit, yes, you can do things to some extent to prepare, but always sometimes it's going to still be a little bit of a shock to the system. But I would recommend have this in the back of your mind and then say to yourself, well, if this happens, then I'm going to do this. So if you go off track, then you're going to do this to pull it back on track. So let's talk about the initial days and the weeks of what happens in a calorie deficit. Now, this is where progress is usually at its best. This is where you feel like on cloud fucking nine, because you've got that motivation right through the roof. You said, I'm going to commit to this. I'm going to do this diet. I'm going to do this deficit. This is the last time I'm going to go on a fucking diet. No more fad diets. No more fucking Slimming World. No more this, that, and the other bullshit fucking diet. I'm going to commit to this. I'm going to go at it. And I'm going at great guns. So motivation is literally right at the top. This is where it's at its peak. And this is where sticking to the deficit is slightly easier than at any other time of this process. Don't let that be an illusion to you that everybody else is different, that when they go through their fat loss phase, they just maintain this motivation the whole way through. Nope. Even me, there are peaks and troughs where you feel like, I don't want to fucking do this deficit fucking shit anymore. That always happens. So bear that in mind, is that you are going to go through peaks and troughs, and probably the peakiest of the peaks is day one. And I don't want to sound too pessimistic about this process, but it's probably a little bit downhill from there. So you've got to kind of set yourself up for this process, that it's not going to be plain sailing from day one. It's just not. And give yourself that wake up call, give yourself that realization. And this is where the importance of loving the process comes into place. Because if you love going to the gym, then this whole thing becomes that little bit easier. No one loves eating less food. Let's fucking be honest about this. But the process of going to the gym, of exercising, of being fit, of kind of pushing yourself hard, if you enjoy that process, that is half the battle. And that will get you through a lot of those down times, a lot of those down days. Now, let's scroll back to that first week. In that first week, you're going to see the scale weight drop. If you're in a deficit, you are going to see the scale weight drop. And that's going to be almost like this false positive. Because what is happening here is that if you're going from a point where you're eating either in a surplus or at maintenance, if you then suddenly drop that, especially if you go into quite a big calorie deficit, you are going to see glycogen, i.e. the energy in your muscles, drop quite rapidly, quite significantly. With that is going to come a whole degree of water weight loss as well. So this is why in the first week, you're going to see some pretty big dips. If you've got motivation up high, so your adherence to your calorie deficit is going to be probably at its best, and you're going to see these water weight drops as well. Both of those things combined mean you're going to see a big shift on the scales in those first few days. Now, obviously, if you've calculated your calorie deficit and it's not quite right, either that scale weight won't move at all, or it will move very, very slowly. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing. That doesn't necessarily mean you should stop or you should do something different. It just means that you might need to adjust those calories a little bit more. Now, I always say, don't do anything for the first 7 days. Stick to your calories, whatever you've calculated them at, for 7 days. If after 7 days that scale weight hasn't budged, and you can honestly, truthfully say to yourself that you ate that number of calories every single day of that week, then adjust your calories from there. So you've got this high level of motivation. You've probably also thrown out the calorie dense food. You've said to yourself, even though Simon says all the fucking time you can eat whatever you want, you can kind of have chocolate, you can have donuts as long as you're managing it, you've probably gone into this process to say, well, actually, I'm going to cut that stuff out for now. I'm not going to eat that shit. I'm not going to eat the donuts, the refined foods, the refined sugars, the processed foods. I'm going to stick to something healthy. You've probably gone into this dieting process with that mindset. And again, that just helps the calorie deficit be a bit more easy to manage, because you haven't got all of these calorie dense foods coming in that you've got to then compensate for elsewhere by maybe eating less, which makes you feel hungry, and so on and so on and so on. Early on, you got this kind of perfect storm of motivation high, less calorie dense foods probably creeping themselves into your diet, and also you've got these water weight drops which are helping you get a significant change on the scales. So this might then start to kick on and start to make that motivation really kind of hold high at that point as well. Now, at this point, maybe between the first 1 to 2 weeks, you're probably also going to feel a level of hunger. Now, willpower and motivation will probably take over and get you past that for the majority of cases. If it doesn't, and if like hunger is way too high, then it's maybe a sign that you should dial calories back a little bit and then be a little more conservative with your calorie deficit. But you've also got to bear in mind that if you are someone who's used to eating at certain times of the day. Now, when I used to work in an office, I used to eat at the fucking same time of day every single day. I used to have my protein shake when I finished at the gym around about 7 o'clock. I used to have porridge at like 9 o'clock, nuts at like 10:30, lunch at like 12 o'clock, and so on and so on and so on. Now, when I came to change that and go into a calorie deficit and maybe say, well, actually, I can't have the more frequent meals that I enjoyed before, I'm going to have to cut a few of these out, then it's the case, well, for those first few weeks, I was just eating. I was just habitually used to, chewing on some nuts. That's what she said. As part of my daily routine. And therefore taking that out, kind of like, I just almost felt like I was hungry when actually I probably wasn't. So you have this period of adjustment. If you have this very regular eating pattern, you have that period of adjustment. But trust me, after 1 to 2 weeks of really sticking to it and making sure that you do adhere to that calorie deficit, then you will find that hunger probably isn't so strong at specific times of day. It might take a little bit of adjustment, but it is possible. Now, if you can't get over that period, you can't get over those times where you feel super hungry, eat at those points where you feel hungry, but replace it with something that's lower calorie. So if I was having, say, nuts at 10:30 as like a mid-morning snack, replace that with a few sticks of celery or something like that is very low calorie, but you get the feeling of eating at the same time. So let's now talk about, we kind of touched on hunger there. So let's talk about hunger as you progress into your calorie deficit. You are obviously going to go through these processes, these days, these weeks where, hunger, unfortunately, is probably going to go up. You have a hormone called ghrelin, which is kind of labeled as the hunger hormone. And then you also have a hormone called leptin, which is kind of, let's say, is the feeling of fullness. It's that type of hormone. It's the satiating hormone. Now, usually what's going to happen is your body really doesn't want to lose body fat. Now, this is where people get confused with starvation mode, which in a previous podcast, we've completely put to bed. Don't worry about starvation mode, not a thing. Now, in the book, The Hungry Brain by Stephan Guyenet, which I've done a podcast on before, and if you haven't heard that interview that I've done with him, go and check out that episode of the podcast or go buy the book. It's a fantastic book about how your brain operates in relation to body fatness and how it's going to try to what he labels as defend your level of body fatness. Your body doesn't want to lose body fat. It wants to maintain it and keep hold of it. So what happens is you have this response where ghrelin goes up, leptin comes down. These are those hormonal changes that are happening. So potentially you're feeling more hungry the deeper you go into your calorie deficit because your body doesn't want to get rid of this body fat. So this is all kind of therefore feels like the deeper and deeper you go into your fat loss phase is the harder it becomes. And that is true. And this is where I would say that there are some things that you can do to try and combat that. And Stefan goes into this in more detail. And again, go into those podcasts where I talk about, I think it's 6 ways to control your cravings. I'll go into these in a little bit more detail. But you can do things to help yourself. Now, you can't really impact hormones directly. It's not really a thing. If you've got some sort of Insta guru, some fitness dude, nutritionist guy who's saying that he can manipulate all your hormones and give you some sort of hormone diet, then he's talking horseshit and you should move on very, very quickly. But you can do things that are advantageous just by doing like the real basics, really. If you are eating a more nutrient dense diet, so less pizza, less refined sugars, less of these sorts of donuts and things like that, which have these perfect combinations of carbohydrate and fat, less of that, not totally eliminated, but less of it, and replacing it with more nutrient dense foods like fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, all of those different sorts of things, you are going to be able to kind of almost change the set point at which your body tries to defend its body fat level. Now that all sounds pretty complicated, and almost you don't really need to know what's going on. All you need to know is that the most advantageous thing you can do is lose body fat, eat a more nutritious diet, sleep well, exercise, and stay well hydrated. If you do all of those different sorts of things, you are doing what you can to help your body from being the most like hormonally advantageous position without having to worry about like specific fucking hormone diets and shit like this that you might hear about across the world of the internet. And the other thing to bear in mind is that as you go through this calorie deficit phase, is you are going to hit a period of metabolic adaptation or adaptive thermogenesis. Again, I've spoken about this previously, and if you want to go into more detail, the Diet Break podcast is one that you should really check out. But this is where your body starts to get used to running on lower calories. So that point at which you have dropped calories and you've decided to increase your calorie burn, or you try to decrease your calories consumed to try and again kickstart that fat loss phase, there's a point at which that kind of starts to become difficult to continue with. It's difficult for you to add more exercise. It's difficult for you to keep cutting calories without impacting your adherence. And that's the point at which your body has started to say, well, okay, we're going to just regulate a few things so that we don't burn as much energy. So natural movement, you're going to feel more lethargic. All of these different sorts of things are going to impact metabolic adaptation and cause maybe a slowdown in the process. And these all hint towards a period where you'd want to take maybe a diet break. And that can be anywhere between sort of like 3 days right up to like 4 weeks or even longer, depending what you want and what feels right for you. So I would always approach a fat loss phase with periods of maintenance. Periods at which you say, I am literally not going to even try and diet here. Whatever progress I have made, that's great, but I am going to plan a period of maintenance. And this just allows you to just kind of take a psychological break from dieting, and it allows you just to kind of, I'm not going to say like reset hormones and things like that, but certainly you are going to get a little bit of an advantage from a metabolic adaptation point of view. You're going to just allow things to almost reset themselves, not quite, probably to the extent that you would hope. And as soon as you push back into that calorie deficit, you are going to get some of those adaptations and those hormonal changes happening again. But it's mainly from a psychological break that I would kind of go for that approach. So when you're starting out on your calorie deficit, always say like maybe 12 to 16 weeks tops is how much you're going to push this. Then you're going to have a period of maintenance for however long, maybe a week, maybe 4. Then you're going to go into another calorie deficit phase, 12 to 16 weeks, and you're going to keep going through that cycle until you get to the point at which you feel like you've achieved your goal. So they're the key things that I would say is that you need to set yourself up for when it comes to what to expect when you go into a calorie deficit. First of all is don't be frightened or don't be put off by the fact that this can be a lonely experience. Get yourself some accountability, get yourself a support group, a support network, whether that's friends, family, or just random people off the internet in a Facebook group that really are on the same journey as you. That's going to be super important for that motivation and that support when shit gets difficult. So bear that in mind. In those initial days and weeks, you're going to have that weight loss drop from a lot of glycogen depletion and also water loss as well. So bear that in mind, that first initial week or so where you see those rapid weight losses on the scales, don't get too carried away. I would always say don't get carried away with your peaks and don't get too depressed by those lows as well. So make sure that when you're in that sort of early stage as well, you're really paying attention to hunger. You might have some changes to your hunger levels as you adapt and change when you eat, especially if you're removing certain meals and snacks from your diet. So expect that. Also, as you go further into that deficit, expect for hunger to increase as your ghrelin, your hunger hormone, goes up. But you can do things to combat that by just making your diet more nutritious, making sure that you're still losing weight, making sure that you're still exercising, sleep, stress, all of those things. You're optimizing all of those things that you can control. Don't be suckered into hormone diets and shit like that from people on the internet. And bear in mind that a diet break is probably going to be advantageous for anyone who is dieting more than 12 to 16 weeks. Probably at some point, whether that diet break consists of a week or 4 weeks, you're probably going to want to have some period where you just dial things back a little bit, reset yourself from a psychological point of view, and then go again. So overall, bear in mind that this is a tough process. There are some simple basics that you need to stick to and you need to adhere to, but never be deluded by the fact that this is still a tough process. It gets hard, it gets difficult. But trust me, once you are there, once you have learned more about yourself, your body, your nutrition, and how to maintain once you've actually lost that weight, then it's an empowering experience. And nobody, absolutely nobody, got to this stage where they felt absolutely amazing when they looked in the mirror and said, you know what? That just was not worth it. No one ever said that. So bear that in mind. You're always working towards something where you feel like you are going to be super, super proud of what you've achieved once you get there. So I hope that little bit of a podcast, a little bit of an answer to that question that I got on Instagram was helpful. Hopefully that was helpful to show you actually what you can kind of expect when you're going to come into a calorie deficit. If it did, come and visit me on Instagram at iron_paradise_fitness. Maybe even drop me a question just like this follower did to say, hey Simon, love that podcast about calorie deficit. I'm really struggling with this problem. Maybe you could do a podcast on that. And I'll say, sure thing, boss. No problem. I covered that in episode 25. Don't worry. No, I won't say that. I will turn it into a podcast if I can. So please come give me those questions. And if you want more information about what I do at Iron Paradise Fitness, maybe you want to read some of my fat loss articles, maybe you want to read some articles on how to build muscle, and maybe you even want to download my free Lean Life Kickstarter pack where you get a free 4-week training program and a guide on how to calculate calories in a super simple way. You can find that with a link in the show notes to ironparadisefitness.com. I suggest you go and check that out. But until then, and until the next time, all I'm going to say is keep living the lean life, and I'll see you for the next one.